Hello and welcome to Balliol College. This is the first of our Insight talks, and tonight we're going to look at the executive functions of the brain with Rosemary. So I hope that you have received alongside the link a task that she sent you to get you engaged with the topic. And without further ado, Rosemary, would you like to introduce us to the executive functions of the brain?
Okay, hello everyone. So my name's Rosie, or Rosemary. I'm a PhD student at Oxford, and I study experimental psychology. And today I'm going to talk a bit about the executive functions, which are the control system of the brain. But first of all, I'd just love to learn a little bit about you guys. I just would love it if, I don't know if you're able to react. There should be a reaction bar that you can use, and you could just give me some sort of reaction if any of you are interested in studying psychology. I would love to see how many of you that is. Oh, we've got some lovely reactions there. Fantastic. Is there anyone who's interested in neuroscience? Maybe give a reaction there. Fantastic. So we've got quite a few people who are interested in the brain, but plenty of people who are interested in other things as well. Okay, I've just gone. Sorry, I'll just have to reshare my screen because I've lost it, but that's absolutely fine. Okay, back to my screen. So I'm just going to tell you, just to start with, a little bit about me. So, I've got these funny arrows here. I obviously haven't done the animation very well, but a little bit about me. So my name's Rosie. As I said, I'm a PhD student studying experimental psychology here at the University of Oxford. And I'm particularly interested in early development and the development that children go through up until before they start school, so the preschool years. But a little bit about what I've done so far since I was at school, since I was in your shoes. So I studied at the University of Liverpool, and I did a BA in psychology and French. It was a bit of a random combination, but it was nice. I got to do a year abroad, and I got the experience of psychology there as well. Then I finished, and I worked for a charity for 6 months doing some admin work, and decided that wasn't really for me. So I went off to do a master's degree in developmental linguistics, which is it's a mix of psychology and linguistics. It's kind of that in between of the two. Then I stayed in Edinburgh for a few years. I worked as a research assistant. I did some work with children with special needs. I also worked at a primary school for a little bit during this time. And then COVID happened, as I'm sure we all remember. I'm sure you guys were affected by that. And I couldn't work in schools anymore, and I did some online teaching English as an additional language. And then we move on to where I came to Oxford. I was working as a research assistant for a couple of years on a big project, which is to do with child development as well, and executive functions, which we'll talk about today. Sorry, I muted myself there. And now, sorry, I don't know why it keeps muting me. And now here I am, I'm doing a PhD in experimental psychology at the University of Oxford. So it hasn't been a straightforward journey. I haven't gone straight from, doing my undergraduate degree to being here. And I think it just kind of goes to show that you can do lots of different things. And all of this experience that I've had has really helped me to really understand the field that I'm working in a bit more, and to have some really good experience that helps with my degree. And if you have questions about my journey later on, you're very welcome to ask them. But for now, I will move on to the topic for today, which is executive functions. So first of all, we're just going to talk about what executive functions are. Again, I'd love it if you could use your reaction. Give me a thumbs up or some sort of reaction if you've ever heard of executive functions before having done the activity I sent you. Had you ever heard of them? So yeah, we've got quite a few people that have heard of them, but I'm not sure that everyone will have heard of them before. So it's something that we don't talk about that much in day-to-day language. We'll talk about what the components of executive functions are and how we measure them. And we'll talk about how executive functions develop over the lifespan. And finally, we'll have a little chat about whether executive functions can be improved. So first of all, what are executive functions? So executive functions, we can kind of think of them as like the control system of the brain. So they are these skills that we use to control our behavior, particularly when we're working towards goals. And they're particularly important when we're doing something that's challenging, something that takes a lot of effort. So there's lots of research that links them in particular to math skills. So children who have really good executive function skills often go on to do well in maths as well. And that makes sense because maths is difficult throughout your learning journey. With reading, for example, you know it's very difficult to start with, but then you learn to read and it becomes a little less difficult. Maths continues to be difficult throughout your journey at school. So executive function skills are these, we'll talk about each of the components a little bit more in detail, but they're these skills, you can think of them generally as these skills we use to control our behavior. And executive function skills have been linked to lots of positive outcomes for people. And these include things like success at school, and also for young children being ready for school, and quality of life, physical health. So things like people with good executive function skills are less likely to have problems with overeating and obesity. They're also less likely to have problems with substance misuse. And they're even linked to, there's one study that has linked strong executive function skills to having a happy marriage as well. So there's all sorts of different benefits to having good executive function skills, but we'll talk more about what they are in a moment. They start to develop in infancy, so very early on, and they continue to develop throughout the lifespan. And I'll just give you an example to show how children might use executive function skills when they're at nursery school. I always like to bring things back to small children because that's my real area of interest. I work with children at nursery school quite a lot. So I'll give you an example here. We've got this example that imagine that you're at a nursery school and you ask a child to go find 10 blocks and make a really big tower. So what do they have to do? They have to use their executive function skills in lots of ways here. They have to pay attention to what you say. They have to remember the information. They have to process that information and look through the box of toys and not get distracted by what they see. They have to stay focused on the task and avoid distractions, even if there are other children around who are doing interesting things. Then maybe they have to think flexibly about it. They can't build the tower upwards because it keeps falling over, so they have to build it sideways. And finally, if you ask them to do something else, you ask them to change task and sort out the toys instead, they need to be able to focus on that. So these executive function skills, and these are all skills that we don't really think about in day-to-day life, but they are skills that, particularly for children often really struggle with. For us as adults, they become a little bit more automatic. You have so much practice following these sorts of simple instructions that it might become a little bit easier to follow these sorts of instructions. But let's talk a little bit about, so where are executive function, what area of the brain is particularly responsible for executive functions? So there's lots of studies using brain scanning techniques, things like we've got this picture of an EEG cap here, which is a way of mapping out the brain. And it seems that the prefrontal cortex, that's this area here in yellow on the brain here, is particularly responsible for executive functions. And this makes sense. This area has been linked to things like planning and decision making and controlling your behavior. So it makes a lot of sense that it's related to executive function skills, but other areas are also related. So let's go dive a little bit deeper into what executive functions are. So we know that they are the control system of the brain. We know that they're what we use to control our behavior on a day-to-day basis. But what are the different areas of executive functions? So there are three main components that we talk about. We've got working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. And there is a little bit of debate. There's always a bit of debate in research about other areas that might be included, things like attention and self-regulation, emotional regulation. But these are the three key areas that we often talk about. And I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail on each of these and how we measure them as well. So first of all, we'll talk a little bit about working memory. So working memory is the system that we use to temporarily store information in the brain. So it's not long-term memory. It's not the information that we store in our working memory. We'll store in our brain for maybe 10 to 15 seconds, no longer than that. And it's the memory that we use to remember instructions, remember information over a short period of time, is that you are using your working memory right now to listen to what I'm saying and to process that information and understand it. But chances are you won't remember the exact words that I'm saying right now. You won't remember the exact information unless you make a conscious effort to remember that information. And there are different components of working memory. So we've got this, what we call the phonological loop, which is the verbal working memory. So this is the memory that we can use to remember verbal information. And we often use this. So if you're reading, you'll convert that information into verbal information, and then you'll keep that in your memory. There's also what we call the visuospatial sketchpad, which is how we remember visual information. So if you remember the location of objects, or you may also convert information into visual information in your mind. So if I asked you to go to the shop and get me a banana, an apple, an orange, and some milk, some people might remember that as the words, but other people might convert that to imagery and remember that as imagery instead. And then we've got this central executive, which kind of controls your attention, controls what you're paying attention to in the environment, and how that, which then leads into these other areas of working memory. And the important thing to remember about the working memory is that it is not long-term memory. It's you won't necessarily remember any of this information tomorrow. And so, you know, if somebody tells you their phone number, you might be able to remember it for long enough to write it down, but you won't be able to remember that exact number tomorrow, probably, unless you are real whizzes with your working memory. And it kind of spans different areas of the brain. So we do have the prefrontal cortex, which is that area that's associated with executive functions in general. That's responsible for this kind of what we pay attention to and how that kind of integrates with the other areas, the visuospatial sketchpad and the phonological loop. We've got other areas of the brain involved as well, because of course we've got this area that's related to hearing, that's related to the phonological loop, or the language area of the brain. And then we've got the area that's related to vision is also involved in this. So it's really, you know, there's a lot that's going on when we remember this information, when we remember information over a short period of time. And so let's have a little look at different ways of measuring this working memory. So when we are, as researchers in psychology, when we're interested in understanding how good people are at working memory, how good someone's working memory is, we need to use tasks to understand that. So I'm just going to give you one example task. There's lots of different ways that we can measure it. And this is something called a backwards digit span. So now if anyone has a pen and paper to hand, that might be handy, but you don't need it. You can also just try to keep these numbers in your head. So what I'm going to do is give you 4 numbers in a row, and which I will show you on the screen. And then I want you to try to remember them in the opposite order. So if the numbers were 1, 2, 3, I'd want you to try to remember them as 3, 2, 1. And just try and write them in the chat for me. Write whatever you think in the chat. So there will be 4 numbers, just to let you know. Okay, so we've got, sorry, keep muting every time I press the space bar. Okay, we've got 7, 2, 9, 1. Okay, can we just type in the chat bar, what are those numbers backwards? See if you can remember them, if you can. If you're able to write in the chat. I'm not sure if I can see it. I'm not sure I can see the chat, but I'm not sure if you can do it. But if
I can see it.
You can see it? Okay, I can't see it. So have we got some answers coming in there?
Yeah, a lot of the answers, most of the answers are 1927.
Fantastic. That's exactly what it is. Thanks, Jack. Sorry, I can't actually see the chat, so
Rosemary, you can if you alter your view, but it means that you'll see the slide is smaller, but it's up to you. Otherwise, we can tell you what's in there.
okay, perfect. I won't try and do that right now. So I just won't be able to see the chat, but that's okay. Okay, and so so what we had there were 4 items, and I think it sounds like lots of people were fine with that and able to do that. So well done. That's something that not everyone is able to do. Now let's have a try with a slightly longer one. So now we're going to see 7 digits. Oh, sorry, 7 or 8. I think it's 7 digits, and I want you to try to remember those 7 digits as well. So let's have another try with this one. So we've got 1, 6, 4, 5, 2, 8. Yeah. So I think those are all the digits there. So if you could try and write in the chat again, and see if you were correct. So it's trickier the more digits there are, particularly when we're doing this backward span. It gets really tricky at this point, so don't worry if you're not sure. So I'll just show you the answer there, so I don't know, you can check whether you were correct there. So this is just an example of using your verbal working memory. So you can use this memory to remember information and do things at the same time. So when you're listening to these numbers in order, and then you have to change the order around. This is an example of doing multiple things at once, multitasking, and remembering information, but also modifying that information in your mind and processing it. And it's something, so adults can normally remember between 5 and 9 items, depending on your capacity. So well done if you managed to do these 6 items here. That's already, above the lower limit of what adults can do. But it's a really tricky skill, and one that you can train more as well. So if you keep practicing and training, then there is evidence that you can get better at it as well. So for example, people who are like a waiter might be able to remember a really long list of foods because they really practice listening to those. They've really practiced listening to that menu and knowing what those items are, and they may use some strategies as well. Okay, so let's keep going. So now we spoke about verbal working memory, and we've got another area of memory that we want to talk about as well here. So we've got this visuospatial memory. So obviously what we've used just now, I don't know how you use the remember that information in your mind, but you may have used you may have spoken in your mind. So that's what we call this kind of phonological rehearsal, practicing speaking in your mind. But we also talk about this visuospatial memory. So let's have a look at how we measure visuospatial memory. So I'll just give you an example task here. I'm just going to show you a few stars. I think we've got 5 stars will appear on this grid. And then I'm going to give you some different locations on the grid, and you just need to tell me which location had a star in it. So it will be easy to understand once we get started. So I've got a star here, here. Okay. So which of these locations had a star in it? I don't know if you want to write that in the chat. So either A, B, C, or D. It's quite a tricky one to remember, keeping that information in your mind. Because there's a different skill. You can't use that rehearsal that you can use for the verbal memory. So what we can find, I don't know, I can't see the chat, but the answer here was that it was C. C was the answer. That was where we could see that final where there was a star. So this is one of the ways that we measure. Well, wouldn't measure it exactly with this task. It's often a task that we use would be kind of tapping blocks in a certain order and then seeing if someone can repeat the pattern. But I've tried to adapt it so that you can give answers over Teams as well. So this is one area. So we've spoken a little bit about working memory, which is one of the areas of executive functions. Another area that's really key is inhibitory control. So this is the skill that we use to kind of avoid distractions, avoid impulses, and override your natural responses and instincts. And it's something that's really important to be able to do in order to be kind of successful in academic situations. For example, sometimes it's very tempting to listen to the conversation that's going on near you in the classroom, but you need to override that response in order to stay focused on your work. Or you may find that one day you want to go out with your friends, but you know that you need to stay in and do some work on an essay, and so you need to be able to override the temptations in order to stay focused on and do and select a behavior that's more appropriate to what you're doing in that moment. Again, you can see here that the prefrontal cortex is an important area for inhibitory control. This is just from a study that used brain scanning. And yeah, so there are different areas of inhibitory control. So we've got this kind of self-control area of inhibitory control. So this is kind of when you really kind of consciously have to control what you're doing. So things like avoiding going out so you can study, or avoiding eating some cake because you want to lose weight. So this is one area of inhibitory control. And we also have this interference control, which is a bit more cognitive. So we might use this skill to kind of control your attention and thoughts. So stay focused on the task that you need to stay focused on, even if there's distracting information going on in the world around you. And so let's have a little look at some of the ways that we can test inhibitory control. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Stroop task. Maybe just give me a thumbs up if you're familiar with it, if you've seen it before. Yeah, so we've got some people who are familiar there. So first of all, I'll just show you, this is, if you want to just read this list of items here, it's quite easy to read because the color is the same as the word. In the Stroop task, what I want you to do is to say the color of the word, not the word that's written there, but the color of the word. And if you go through these items here, it should be quite easy to do because the color matches up with the word. And then, so we've got this other list here. So if you want to just quickly go through and maybe just in your head, think about what the color of each word is there in order, and you may find that it's a little bit more difficult, then that's because you're really having to inhibit your response there. Your natural response is to read the word because you're very familiar with speaking English and, and reading, and you're used to reading the text on the page, but you have to ignore that and just focus on the color. And that can be really tricky, particularly when they're contradictory, like in this case. But in adults tend to do quite well on this task. So we can't always just measure how many items they got correct. So instead, what we often use in this case is response time. So how quickly an adult can read out this list of words. And that's a way of comparing how good somebody's response inhibition is. And so that's just one example of how we can measure inhibitory control. And finally, we'll talk about cognitive flexibility, which is the final area of executive functions that we're going to talk about today. So this is the skill that we use to switch between different goals and tasks and strategies. So this is the skill that we use to kind of do multiple things at once, to adapt to changes in our routines, and to apply flexible thinking to problems, to come up with strategies. So, for example, I've got a couple of pictures here. So, for example, for children, you might find that if they're doing a jigsaw puzzle and they just can't get that piece into the puzzle, they might just need to rethink their strategy and move the puzzle piece around so that the pieces match up, or put it in somewhere else, into a different location on the puzzle, even if it's very tempting to think it goes with the pieces of the same color. Or we've got this other example here, more kind of maybe relevant to your lives, is, if like what we were expecting this week. If there are tube strikes, you might have to find that you need to completely replan your routine. You've got a plan set out for the day and you need to change that. You need to be able to adapt to and come up with strategies of how you're going to get home. And you might need to switch from what your original plan was. And that can be quite difficult for some people. And so there's one way that we measure cognitive flexibility, and you may have noticed this in the video that if you watch the video, there was the task that I sent out. As part of the task that I sent out, you might be familiar with this task. So this is a task that we use to measure cognitive flexibility, so people's ability to switch to kind of new rules and apply new strategies. We particularly use it with children, but we might also use it with adults, using kind of response time as a way of measuring it, because adults tend to be quite good at it. So what we would do here, we've got these cards here, and they've got different shapes and different colors and different numbers on them as well, different quantities. And what we might ask the child to do is we say, first of all, we're going to sort out cards according to the shape that we've got on them. And so we'd show them this card and we'd say, which of these 4 boxes would you put the card in? Does it go in the first one, the second one, the third one, or the fourth one? And you can see here, I'm sure, as adults or as older people, you know that you can that this card should go on the second pile there, the card with the triangles, if we're sorting out by shape. You practice this again and again, so the child will get quite good at sorting the cards out by shape. So then we've got this one here, and they need to learn that they need to put it in the final pile there. And then after you've done quite a few trials of sorting the card out by shape, you need to switch the rule and tell the child that now we're not playing the shape game anymore. We need to switch and do the color game instead. And then you give them this card here, which has blue stars, and they may be very tempted to put it in the first pile, but they need to switch that rule in their mind and understand that they need to sort it according to color instead of according to shape. And that can be incorporating this new rule and adapting from the behavior that they've already been that they've become accustomed to. Can be quite difficult for young children. Adults, as I said, are a little bit better at this, but this task can be used with adults, but we often use response time as a way of looking at the variation between different adults. And so we've covered the 3 different areas of executive function. So we've got working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. And we've said that these 3 areas of executive functions are really important for development across the lifespan, and they're associated. Having good executive function skills is associated with a number of different positive outcomes. But now we want to have a little look at how executive functions develop over the lifespan. So when they start to develop and how we can measure this. But one of the big difficulties that we have here is that the tasks that I've shown you so far are all a little bit too complicated for small children. They all kind of have some sort of language demand. They require them maybe to know the names for shapes, the names for colors, the names for numbers. And so we can't really use these tasks when we're looking at really young children. So how do we measure executive functions in young children and babies? So I'm going to show you a task that's a little bit like the visuospatial working memory task that we looked at when we were speaking about working memory. And this is me here, as you can see, with a little boy. I don't know if you have the sound. It doesn't matter if you do or you don't. But he has to copy the blocks that I press in the same order. And if we keep watching, we can see that he starts to make some mistakes. But So you get the idea. So this is a task that we can use with young children because it doesn't involve any kind of, he doesn't need to speak, he doesn't need to give a verbal response there. All he needs to do is understand that he needs to tap the blocks. So this is one way that we can measure working memory in young children. And now I'll move on to a way that we can measure inhibition. Maybe some of you are familiar with the marshmallow task. Maybe give me a thumbs up if you've seen it before or a kind of an adaptation to it. Yeah, it's a good one. I think there have even been videos going around on TikTok of people doing this with their children, but it is something that psychologists actually use in the lab. So in this task, what you do is you put a marshmallow on a plate and you put it in front of a child and you ask the child to wait until you come back into the room. And when you come back into the room, you're going to give them another marshmallow. So they get 2 marshmallows if they wait, and one marshmallow if they eat it straight away. And it's a great task for kind of looking at how children are able to delay gratification and inhibit their natural response of eating the marshmallow. And something that's really nice about this task is, as you can see, children employ all sorts of different strategies to try to use that inhibition. You might get some children who sit on their hands or look around the room or smell the marshmallow. And you also get some children that really, really struggle with the task and aren't able to avoid that temptation. And children tend to, improve on this task as they get older. Young children are likely to wait only a couple of minutes, if at all, and older children can sometimes wait as long as kind of 10, 15 minutes if the researcher is mean enough to make them sit through that. And I'll just give you another example. So this is a task that we can use for cognitive flexibility, so switching with young children. So in this task, you use kind of a puppet. So you've got one puppet, which is a bear, and it's a friendly, nice bear, and another puppet that's a dragon. So it's a mean dragon, and you tell the child that they need to listen to the bear, but they not listen to the dragon because it's a mean dragon. And you give them instructions, things like touch your head, touch your toes, touch your tummy. And then you tell them that the rule has switched and now they need to listen to what the dragon says, but not what the bear says. So this is a little bit like that card sorting task, but it's a little bit simpler for young children, and you can act it out and make it quite clear. And this is a task, so children, 3-year-olds tend not to pass this task. They tend to continue following the rule of listening to the dragon, even when the rule is switched, listening to the bear, even when the rule is switched. But by the age of 5, most children are able to do this. So it's quite a nice task for looking at that little developmental age between the age of 3 and 5. But you may still be thinking, what about babies? Because none of these tasks work with babies. These tasks all require some sort of level of understanding and some level of language. So what I've got here, I've got a YouTube video that I very much hope will play. So this is a task that we call the A not B task. And this is something that we can use with really young babies, as young as kind of 9 months old, 8 months old. And in this task, you put something under, you hide an object, and then you let the baby find the object so they can see where the object is. Then you hide the object in a different location and see whether the baby can adapt to the new location. So we've got a nice video here of a baby who doesn't manage to pass the task. So just So what you can see there, firstly, it's a good example of the difficulties of working with very young children. They are not as simple to work with as adults if you're wanting to try and collect data. But obviously, as a developmental psychologist, it's something that I'm very interested in. But you could see there that the baby was at that stage where they understood, he or she understood object permanence. He understood that the toy was underneath the blanket, but he wasn't able to apply the new rule and switch to a new location. So you have to get very creative when you want to collect data from babies. I think that's the main message from this slide here. So how does executive function develop over the lifespan? So what we see is that executive function skills improve really rapidly during the preschool years. So before you start school, before the age of about 5, children really rapidly developing their executive function skills, particularly between 2, 3, 4-year-olds are really making all those neural connections at that stage, which are and really rapidly learning how to control their behavior. And then it develops slowly and steadily throughout primary school. And then there's another rapid burst of development at kind of age 11 to 14. And after that, it kind of continues to improve relatively quickly until your 20s, and it kind of continues to improve across the lifespan until about the age of 60, when in some people skills start to decline, or maybe older, depending on the person. And what we can see here, I've got a couple of graphs here. What we can see here is that executive function skills, this graph on the left is talking about the different neural pathways that form in the brain. You can see that we start out with those kind of more basic ones like vision and hearing. Then language pathways start to form, and then a little bit later in development you get these higher cognitive functions, which are things like executive function skills, and they are still forming right up until the end of primary school. So children are still developing those skills, whereas they're learning that the neural pathways related to language are a little bit earlier. And we've got this graph here on the right, which just talks about how the different skills develop over the lifetime, over a lifetime, over the early years, childhood. And what you can see there is that inhibition is a skill that kind of develops a little bit earlier. And then you get the more complex skills, things like planning is kind of integrating all the skills together, and cognitive flexibility tends to develop a bit later. And some researchers have done this really great research looking at chimpanzees, and they find that seems to be the main difference between human toddlers and chimpanzees, is that chimpanzees are not very good at being flexible and switching between different tasks, whereas humans can do it. Whereas chimpanzees can, use the skills of working there. They can remember the location of objects. They can inhibit a response. So that seems to be the big difference there. Okay, and there are a number of different reasons why people might have different differences in executive function skills. And we can see that there is a really high level of variation in executive functions between different individuals. This is both kind of during childhood and later on in life. We see that some people have much better executive function skills than others, and this can be different across the different domains of executive functions. And there are lots of different reasons why this might be. So of course, genetics might come into it. Debatable how much genetics comes into it. I know there have been some twin studies that look at this, and it seems that genetics arguably account for about 50% of variability in executive functions, but according to some other accounts, it's higher or lower. It's possibly higher or lower at different ages. And then there are the environment are the other factors that really lead into executive function, the levels of the variation in executive function skills. So one of these main causes of variation is differences in the home environment. So lots of different factors have been related to variation in executive functions, things like socioeconomic status, so kind of like the education level of your parents and things like this. This is and other factors of bilingualism. So there are various studies that show that it's possible that children who grow up bilingual have a bit of an advantage with executive function skills to start with. I'm not sure whether that carries on into later life, but to start with, at least, there is some evidence for an advantage for bilingual children. Then we've also got the school environment. There are differences in the environment that you are in, the methods used by the teachers, the sort of children that you have around you, and whether. So there's evidence that the educators that use lots of approaches that allow children to kind of to control their emotions and to plan and use lots of strategies that might help children's executive function development. And of course, there's context. So you might find that the same child does really well on a task one day and not so well on another day. And that might be because they're tired. It might be because they're their motivation is different. They might be looking for a reward one day, they might be bored one day. There are lots of reasons why there's so much variation in executive functions between different individuals. But so let's just have a little think about so we've spoken a lot about what kind of good executive function skills look like. So what do you think it might look like if somebody doesn't have very good executive functions? Maybe would you like to have a little type in the chat of what sort of things you might expect from somebody who has difficulty with their executive function skills. So how that might affect their life, things that, and I'll see if I'll try to see it. Oh, I think I can see it. Oh, we've got some lovely answers here. Yeah, we've got, addiction problems, that's true. Can't amend plans if circumstances change, definitely. Disorganized, easily forgets information. Scatty, that's a good word. Difficulty learning in school. Yeah, definitely can't prioritize. Peer pressured, that's an interesting one. Yeah, definitely. If you're not able to control, to inhibit that desire to, fit in and to do what other people are telling you to do. Trouble controlling emotions, easily distracted. Yeah, we've got some really good answers here. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and reshare because okay, sorry, I'll just go back to that. Yes, so we've got some great answers here. So I've got a few on the screen here, but we've really covered a lot of those in the chat there, so that's fantastic. So we've got difficulty starting and finishing tasks, difficulty doing multiple things at once, difficulty remembering goals and following instructions, acting without thinking, difficulty staying focused, inability to control emotional responses. So these are just some of the answers, the examples here. As you mentioned, these can also result in things like difficulty avoiding peer pressure, things like addiction problems, as somebody mentioned. But these are just some of the examples here. But you might recognize that these are all things that we all struggle with sometimes. So executive functions are those skills that we all have to use, and they're difficult for everybody to use, but they are more difficult for some people to use than others. I'm sure that there's nobody here who hasn't had trouble with at least one of these problems at some point. So there's a lot of, given that, having poor executive function skills can have lots of these kind of negative impacts upon your life, there's a lot of research into ways of supporting executive function development. So there are some interventions that have shown success in improving specific executive function skills. So, for example, there are some interventions where people have, trained people, done working memory training to try to train people to remember longer lists of items, or, lots of games that encourage you to build your working memory or build your response inhibition. That's one way that people have tried to improve children or adults' executive function skills. There are also some interventions where they've gone into schools and encouraged the teachers to use different strategies, to encourage children, young people to use strategies to work towards goals and plan better and use their executive function skills a bit more effectively. And there are also some games and different ways of there are lots of different interventions. Some of them are kind of online, some of them are just games that are to be played in real life as well. And they have shown some success, but often in improving the specific executive function skill that they were training. So when you train somebody to remember long lists of words, they get really good at remembering long lists of words. But this doesn't necessarily mean that they get better at maths or the other skills that are associated with executive functions. We've got other examples here. So, there is some support that maybe activities like yoga and mindfulness and exercise can help some people as well with their executive function skills. So I'm going to very briefly talk about, so this is the problem that I mentioned here, that even though you can train specific executive function skills, it doesn't always seem to transfer to other areas like maths. So I'm going to very quickly talk about a program, an intervention that is being carried out in the department that I work in. So this is being carried out here in Oxford, and it's an intervention that's designed to improve children's executive function and math skills. And how we do that is we embed executive function challenges into the context of maths learning at preschool. So we have all of these different games that we bring along to preschools, and which all have maths challenges and executive function challenges. So things like the children have to remember, have a secret number that they need to guess, or they have to remember the location of different shapes. And so far, it seems to be showing a little bit more success in improving both maths and executive function skills, as that's one of the problems that researchers have had, that although you seem to be able to improve executive function skills in a very specific small capacity, you don't seem to be able to improve them as a whole. So that's just a little bit more about this kind of brings back the whole circle to what I'm doing. So this is what I'm involved with at the moment, this intervention project, which helps to improve children's executive function skills. And that, I think, brings me almost to time. So thank you very much for listening. And I think we have a little bit of time for some questions in the chat, if anybody has any.
So what you might want to do, Rosie, is just stop sharing your screen, and then you'll be able to see chat easier. So yes. It is chat you're going to have to use if you want to ask Rosie a question, which might be about all the information she has just imparted to you, or it might be to do with her choices and pathways she's gone on to get to what she's doing now. But please feel free to write away in the chat.
Oh, yeah, we've got some questions here. So I've got a question. Can executive function be affected by hormonal changes such as puberty and menopause? That's an interesting question. So puberty, I'm not 100% sure on puberty. I know that executive function does tend to develop a lot during that. There's a real burst in executive function development during that age period of kind of 11 to 14. So that might be related to puberty. But it does continue to develop further past puberty as well into kind of your until about, it develops quite quickly until about the age of 25, and then slowly after that. Menopause, I think there is evidence that at menopause, sometimes people have difficulty with things like working memory, but there's evidence that I believe inhibition is less affected, but memory can be a bit affected by menopause, potentially. But I could double check on some of those references, but that's an interesting question. So we've got a question here. Does excessive screen time at an early age compromise executive functions? And that's a really interesting question, and it's one that people have been looking at there's lots of research on that at the moment. And what it seems, so it's an interesting one because it's quite difficult to ask parents you'll have to ask parents to report on how much their children use screens, and they don't always report 100% accurately. So it can be difficult to get good data on how much children use screen times, because obviously you can't watch children all the time and see how much they use screens. But there is some evidence that up to a certain point, if children spend up to, I wouldn't know the exact numbers, but up to maybe a couple of hours a week using screens, playing educational games, it can have a positive impact upon executive function skills. But that might be because some of the tasks that people use to measure executive functions are on an iPad themselves. So maybe the children are just a little bit more familiar with that format. But I think over a certain threshold, it does have a negative impact on executive function skills. That's a really interesting question, and it's one that researchers are trying to answer at the moment, because obviously screens are having a big impact on our lives at the moment. We've got so many great questions. Thank you so much for all these questions. So we've got a question here. I was wondering if any specific executive function skills are linked to better academic performance. And that's an interesting question. So I think there is, so what we find when I do a lot of research with younger children, so I've got lots of answers about younger children. I'm less familiar with the literature about older children, so there's definitely a lot of research on there if you want to look this up yourself. But I know that in younger children, it's quite difficult to separate out the different executive functions. So they're often looked at as, we combine them into one overall executive function, because in young children, they have to use them all together so much. You know, if you give a child an instruction, they have to hold that in their mind. They also, they have to use all the executive functions together. And I know that generally executive functions are linked to better academic performance. It's an interesting question, actually. I'm not 100% sure on that one. I know that within maths, different areas of math skills are linked to different executive function skills. So things like when you are having to switch between, if you have an equation with lots of different components where you have to multiply and divide and to the power of whatever, you have to do a lot of switching there, and that's very related. So I think I've got another question here, which is more about studying psychology at uni. So we've got this question here, which is, if this is a course at uni, what jobs can you go into with this? And that's a really good question. So at undergraduate, in order to do something similar to what I'm doing, you would probably go and start with a psychology degree, but you might also go into neuroscience, or you might even go into something like education. There are a lot of different pathways to the type of role that I'm doing. And there are lots of different careers that you can go into, from, for example, a psychology degree or a neuroscience degree. You could, like I'm doing, continue with academia. This would mean, staying in education, going on to do a PhD, but that's only one of the routes. I know people that did psychology that work in sales and marketing now, or HR. You can have like a nice office job. You could work in even kind of something like finance. It really doesn't stop you from doing anything. You could also go on to do a conversion and do teaching. There's lots of different options. And oh yes, we've got a good question here. How intense is the link of executive function issues and neurodivergency? And that's something that has been very well studied in the literature. And so some people consider ADHD to be in itself a difficulty with executive functions. And if you think about the difficulties that people with ADHD have, they're very related to executive function issues. The autism is also related to certain areas of executive functions, and it really depends. Obviously, people with autism have very different symptoms, are very different, present in very different ways. So there is a link between executive functions and autism as well, and other conditions as well. I think there's a lot of research, there's a lot of literature out there. I know that there's another intervention that's being carried out in the department at the moment, which is trying to help families that have a family history of neurodivergency, kind of ADHD and autism, help the parents support their children in executive function development. So there's definitely a lot of literature out there, but it would be, feel free to have a look at it yourself. I think there's a lot out there. We've got, yeah, does it get harder to improve executive functions as you get older? Interesting, yes. So there's a lot of research that shows that the really key times to improve executive function skills are during the preschool period, so up until children start school. There's a lot of research that shows that children's performance on executive function tasks at the age of 3 is really predictive of a lot of outcomes later in life. So if they're doing well on executive function tasks at the age of 3, they're likely to go on to have good executive function tasks, executive function performance later on in life. But of course, that's not to say that you can't do things to change it. You can't do things to improve your executive function skills. I think at those key areas where you have that burst, so at preschool is a good time to intervene. I think also during primary school and secondary school, there's a lot of time to improve your executive function skills as well. And it's possible for sure to improve your executive function skills as an adult, but it might take a little bit more conscious effort on your part if you wanted to executive function skills. But it's something that you can put strategies in place at least to help you to support you to use those executive function skills better. So it's something that you can do consciously as well as less consciously. Okay, we've got lots of questions here. So we've got another question about ADHD, and we've got, is there a link between executive function impairment and neurological disorders such as Alzheimer's? Yes. So executive functions are impaired in Alzheimer's as well. I'm not sure of the exact figures for that. Working memory is certainly impaired in Alzheimer's, but other executive function skills would be impaired as well. That kind of ability to switch between tasks and that ability to avoid doing what you usually do are both skills that are impaired in Alzheimer's. I'm sure I know there's research that's looked into this in more detail as well. But again, I tend to look at 3-year-olds, so I'm less familiar with older people. I'm just looking. Okay, we've got a question here about more about research in general. So how did you get into doing research and what did you research? That's quite a nice question there, just I guess maybe for me to end on, because I think we've got 1 minute left. So I have always been interested in child development. I've always really enjoyed working with children, and I've always been interested in how children develop the skills that they do during the preschool years. I was really lucky when I lived in Edinburgh, when I was doing my master's degree, to be involved in a research group that looked at child language development. So we did lots of experiments in the lab with babies. So we would look at how well they understood language, looking at where they looked, like it was all kind of eye tracking with babies. Then I went on to doing some research with St Andrews, the University of St Andrews, which was looking at executive functions in preschoolers. They were comparing the scores of preschoolers with the scores of chimpanzees, but I was only involved with the preschoolers. And so I just really enjoyed the research. I wasn't willing to finish doing research when I finished my degree. And then I went on to, looking more into the different areas that I might be interested in. And I knew I was interested in the difference between, in that intersection between education, psychology and linguistics, and I kind of ended up here. Started out working as a research assistant in the department, and now I'm doing a PhD because that's kind of the next step to go further in research. But it's a really nice question. So I think that's all I have time for today. Well, thank you very much to everyone who's listened.
Thank you, Rosemary, for that absolutely fascinating talk. If you are particularly interested in psychology, you might have already noticed that we've got some other talks related to different aspects of psychology. We've got one on traumatic brain injury coming up on the 14th of February. We have another one about imaging and analysis in neuroscience on the 14th of March. And we have one about using nanobots in a search for Parkinson's. So if you want to see those, do go onto the Balliol College website. You may all have booked them. But thank you for your engagement tonight. There's been some fascinating questions in response to Rosie's presentation. And we will also send you a link to the recordings when we put those up on our YouTube site. So thank you very much and hope to see you all at another talk.
Thank you.